And here we go again. If you remember from my last video on China, I pointed out the differences in our population, respectively, and what they mean. China has 1.3 billion people. We have 300 million people. If China creates 300 million creative, innovative, high-tech entrepreneurs, China has 1 billion people to do the work. If we create 300 million creative, innovative, high-tech entrepreneurs, we have no one to do the work. And I said that that means we have to make some friends. In part, some of that has to do with immigration, and also it has to do with partnering with people around the world. Now, on many occasions I've said, China will do well because China will do as we did and not as we say. Well, let me just give you a few things off the list. Manifest Destiny, the Transcontinental Railroad, the Monroe Doctrine, and the Hoover Dam Project. China has the South China Sea, TPP, the Silk Road, and the Hydroelectric Power Dam Project. But there's something even more important. And that is very simple. China has a rising middle class and a rising economy. India, a rising middle class and a rising economy. Russia, well, kind of has a stagnant middle class and a relatively stagnant economy. The US has a declining middle class and follow the path of the trajectory. Now, there's an old Chinese saying, never underestimate the power of a symbolic gesture. Some Fairview has a saying, never forget the power of a symbolic gesture resides with the person making the gesture. So let's look to emerging nations. Starving children in emerging nations cannot eat symbolic gestures. In addition to which, there are about 1 billion people around the world living on less than $1 a day. If you had $1 billion to give away, you would double their standard of living for one day, and they would still be living on less than $1 a day. Which brings us to my old paradigm. Capital investment plus economic stimulus equals economic development plus growth. So, let's take a look at a few more things. That will have to turn the page. I pointed out in the previous video something everybody knows. And from the quotations of Sun Fairview, everybody knows what everybody knows. The issue is that nobody ever thinks about that. So when I pointed out that China elevated 500 million people from poverty to the middle class, I also pointed out that if they can do it in China, they can do it in, let's say, Africa. And I also pointed out that a man in Africa living in a refugee camp, listening to people talk and hearing 500 million people rising from poverty to the middle class is not thinking of a Center Hall Colonial in Springfield, Illinois, and naming his boys Wally and the Beeve. He's thinking of middle class in China. And of course, he knows it's doable. How does he know this? Because it's been done. But let's take a look at that 500 million people in China who are now in the middle class. China created a massive consumer class. And you've heard all the numbers about who buys from whom and how much, and which company is opening up a plant in China and how they intend to do well, and so on and so forth. And I'm not going to dispute the numbers because it's no point. There's no point to it. I also pointed out that in the next 70 years, a lot of technology will happen. Well, let's take a look at something else. When you look at the size of China's growing consumer economy, what you're really seeing is Henry Ford all over again. Henry Ford cut his workers' hours, their work week, to 40 hours a week, which has become pretty much an industry standard. But he also doubled their salary. Henry Ford did not redistribute the wealth. Henry Ford redistributed the money, and in so doing made it possible for Ford Motor Workers to buy Fords. Now look at China. China elevates 500 million people from poverty to the middle class. They've created a very large consumer class. Just recently, we heard in the news that Chinese have an electric car called the Neo, if I remember correctly. And they're going to have an IPO, an initial public offering. If you're in China, are you going to buy a Neo or a Tesla? That's something you might want to think about. There's something else. If I remember correctly from my youth, the pomegranate used to be called a Chinese apple. So let's come up with a new company, a smartphone called the pomegranate, to compete with the apple. Remember, China not only has 500 million consumers, they also have 500 million workers. And what they can do with that is sell to a market of 500 million people. They could sell Neos, and they could sell the new pomegranate phone made in China. So how does this affect emerging nations? Well, recently it has been reported that warnings were issued, alerts, to emerging nations about doing business with China. The admonition, don't surrender your sovereignty. If that's our concern, we are way off base. Because capital investment, economic stimulus, economic development, and growth in emerging nations, let's say through Africa, creates a consumer class. Not only for the African people to manufacture things and sell them to people in Africa, they will also have a healthy export market to China, and they will become an import market for products made in China. So while we're looking at things in a very short term, the long term is much different. Well, I'm reminded of something that Virgil said, and it was about 500 BC. He said, the greatest wealth is health. Well, for the Chinese economy, the greatest health is wealth. And they are, in their fashion, creating wealth. A consumer class, a middle class, a working class, workers, consumers, importers, and exporters. And when they start doing business with emerging nations, that capital investment and economic stimulus will bring about economic development and growth. And that will be their new market. They will sell to African nations, and they will buy from African nations. We're looking at a population of 1,300,000,000 people. That's a lot of employees. That is a lot of consumers. That is a lot of money. And when you're starting out with emerging nations, you're getting in on the ground floor. You're leveraging your investments.